everybody is here to see Dr. Stacy Sims. She is a wealth of information, and I can tell you that she lives and breathes, and like this is her life's work. This is her passion, and she is constantly immersed in this science and in this research, and it's ever evolving, and she's always on top of it. And she, as Catherine mentioned, is extraordinarily generous with her time and with her wisdom. And she's also just a kick-ass person. So I am too very psyched to get her on the stage and me off the stage. So let's all sit back and enjoy Stacy. Well.
Hi. Thank you. I feel very humbled with that intro. And I realize that it is the last session of the day, so I thank everybody for being here. And I want to preface this talk with the fact that I am talking a bit science heavy, because the goal of this talk is to get you to understand what's going on with your body with regards to the hormones that are changing, and then what you can do about it to keep your body progressing in your sport and achieving your performance potential. So if you feel like it's a little bit over your head at the start, don't worry. I'm going to try to disseminate it down as much as I can, and then feel free to ask questions after the talk when we get back into the booth. So let's get started. So the first thing I really want to describe is, what is menopause? We've talked about it so much, and there's so many different words to describe menopause. So specifically, I want to get into what is perimenopause, menopause, and postmenopause. So we have the very early perimenopause. So this is actually that early time set somewhere in your late 30s, early 40s for most people, where you haven't really seen changes in your cycle, but you're starting to experience maybe some sleep problems. You realize that your training isn't working for you. You're wondering what's going on. You're starting to put on a little bit more belly fat. And a lot of times this is put up to stress, poor sleep habits because of stress, lifestyle stress. But in reality, it has to do with the changing ratios of your estrogen and progesterone. Then we get into the early menopause transition, and this is when your cycles start becoming a little bit irregular. The late menopause transition starts with the first 60-day cycle, so 3 months-ish between cycles. And then late perimenopause, this is really what we call that year of no periods at all before we actually get to menopause. So menopause is actually one point in time on the calendar. So we kind of joke about it saying it's the birthday of your menopause. So it technically marks 12 months of no periods. Then you have postmenopause after that. So we know that postmenopause is right after that birthday of your menopause. And we have the early postmenopausal years. So we have the first year postmenopause, where you're still experiencing some changes and you're like, well, I thought I was in postmenopause, but I'm still having vasomotor symptoms. I'm still having poor sleep, and I'm not quite sure what's going on. And your hormones are still flatlining, but you're not producing any eggs. You have technically ovarian failure. Then your years 2 to 6 postmenopause, you can still experience vasomotor symptoms. You can still have some iron deficiency issues. We know that autoimmune diseases pop up in early menopause. So this is a time where things are still a little bit hectic and changing, and you're like, well, what's going on? I thought I was in postmenopause. But most people will stop having a lot of the symptoms and issues within 2 to 3 years postmenopause. So now that we have the terms, I really want to kind of dig into, what is this? Why are we experiencing all of these issues? And we know specifically about the female sex hormones. We have estrogen and progesterone. So when we talk about estrogen, there are actually 3 types of estrogen. And I know that Carla went into quite a few details on the hormones, but I want to kind of remind you and explain how these hormones kind of interact. So we have 3 types of estrogen. So we have estradiol, which is our typical E2, and this is what we normally talk about when we talk about estrogen and the estrogen benefits and what's dropping off. We have estrol, which is E3, and this is primarily in pregnancy. We have estrone, which is E1, and this becomes the predominant estrogen during postmenopause, but it is 10 times weaker than what E2 is. We have progesterone, and it has anti-estrogenic effects. So when we're talking about ratios changing in perimenopause, you can become estrogen dominant. And then sometimes when progesterone comes back up and it counters estrogen, you don't have quite as many symptoms. So this is where we're talking about the ratios changing and how that affects our body. We have the follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, and this is what stimulates the ovarian follicle to actually drop an egg to increase your E2 production. And we know that after you hit that menopausal state, FSH will still keep rising because it's trying to stimulate the ovary to drop an egg, even though there is that ovarian failure and no more ovulation will take place. Luteinizing hormone, it does stimulate the ovaries to produce that E2. And then across the board, so many times we often forget to talk about testosterone. Now, testosterone is produced in both the ovaries and the adrenal glands. And with estrogen, it's necessary for bone, cognition, sex drive, but it doesn't have an immediate drop like estrogen and progesterone do because it's not tied to the ovarian cycle. So testosterone will still be there after you go through menopause. It has a slower decline with age. So this is what our cycles look like when we're premenopause. Pretty regular. We have a follicular phase, we have a luteal phase, we have estrogen that surges right before ovulation with a luteinizing hormone pulse. It dies down. We have progesterone that comes up, estrogen that starts to come up, and you have your follicular stimulating or follicle stimulating hormone that is on the downward drop before it starts to try to get another ovulation going. So we see this nice little pattern going, and this is what our normal premenopause aspect looks like. But when we get to perimenopause and postmenopause, this is where we see all these changes of estrogen, progesterone going all over the show. You have different ratios. And the biggest change over here is about the 5 years before you actually hit that one point in time, menopause. Then after that one point in time of menopause and postmenopause, we have this flatlining of estrogen, progesterone that is lower than what your follicular phase is in your premenopausal year. But we also have this elevation of FSH and LH. This is why some doctors will test all of these hormones to see what levels these are to determine if you're postmenopausal or not. So then the question is, okay, well, what is going on? When we talk about estrogen, like I said, E2 is predominant in the reproductive years. Estrone is predominant in menopause, but it's reactive. It's not proactive. So what I mean by that is we have estrogen receptors that are, we have estrogen A or alpha and estrogen B or beta. And these two respond and will create a feedback system to drive different mechanisms like muscle protein synthesis. But when we have estrone, it's reactive to something. So it doesn't drive the muscle protein synthesis. It primarily drives things like cell proliferation, or it drives inflammation because it's reacting to a stress in the body. And it's really important to understand the differences here because this also plays into how our body responds to training, how our body responds to nutrition. So when we talk about the key functions of E2, this is your predominant premenopausal estrogen. It's really important to understand that it can affect every cell in the body. So when we talk about the changes that our body undergoes through the menopausal transition, and we start seeing different changes like losing lean mass, we're having insulin resistance, we're having more inflammation and oxidative stress. It's because E2 is a driver in a lot of these mechanistic controls. So it helps with your protein synthesis. It helps with controlling blood glucose. It helps get carbohydrate or glucose into the skeletal muscle. It helps reduce oxidative stress. It also helps with force generation, which is important as we get older. And I'll get into a little bit of training mechanisms. When we lose our E2, we lose our power production. We also know that estrogen affects the brain. We have an interplay of serotonin and dopamine. So when we start having higher levels of estrogen or in our brain, we can have a higher activation of serotonin. it sounds like a good thing, but when we have too much serotonin that is upregulated in the brain and too many receptor sites that are activated, when the estrogen drops, serotonin drops, and this is when we experience depressive episodes or anxiety. Estrogen is also tightly tied to appetite regulation. It's also tightly tied to thermoregulation because it controls the way our vessels respond to vasodilation and constriction. So again, when we start having vasomotor symptoms and hot flashes, night sweats, it has to do with this perturbance in estrogen and temperature. Estrogen is really important for bone regulation as well as progesterone. So they work together where estrogen is more involved in absorption and it decreases the breakdown of the bone, where progesterone is responsible for bone turnover to increase the density. So they work together for bone density. And then we talk about the metabolic considerations of estrogen as well. So we know, again, it helps with glucose or blood glucose sensitivity. It helps with GLUT4 activity. I'm going to come back to GLUT4 a little bit later in this presentation because you'll hear me talk about it quite a bit. Again, it affects appetite hormones, controls appetite hormones, and is also responsible for changing our fuel sources during exercise to increase fatty acid release. When we talk about progesterone, progesterone has an antagonistic effect of estrogen, where it will inhibit muscle protein synthesis. It increases catabolism. And the reason for that, because the main driver of progesterone when it elevates after ovulation is to actually increase the endometrial lining or build the tissue in the uterus. Not only build that tissue, but make sure it is full of amino acids, make sure it's full of glycogen so it can feed any kind of implanted egg that might be fertilized. And that is the main goal of progesterone. But the side aspects of all the progesterone receptor sites in the brain, as well as in the bone, we see that it has some effects too. The benefit of progesterone in the brain, it's neuroprotective. It helps modulate pain. It increases our pain tolerance. It also has a bit of a calming effect. So I've talked about the bone aspect of it. Now, in a metabolic sense, it increases our autonomic nervous system. So our respiratory rate increases, our heart rate increases. It also increases our core temperature, but it also is a powerful anti-inflammatory agent. So there's benefits and some of the negatives that come with progesterone. Now, remember, neither one of them are really found in isolation. The only time you really find E2 in isolation is that surge right before ovulation. And this is where you have a bigger aspect of muscle protein synthesis. So as these hormones start to flatline, there's this pattern of, okay, my body is really going to change in its responses because these hormones are so tied into so many different key factors of what allows my body to function how I know it to function. So when we talk about what happens in perimenopause with these hormone fluctuations, we know that there's a reduced sensitivity to anabolic stimuli. So what I mean by that is when we know that estrogen stimulates the satellite cell of the muscle. So we talk about it with regards to stimulates protein synthesis. When we have a changeover of our estrogen ratios or we don't have as much estrogen, then there's a muting or blunted effect of being able to stimulate protein synthesis within the muscle. There's a signal as well to increase subcutaneous, specifically that deep visceral belly fat and intramuscular fat, because again, estrogen stimulates free fatty acids, but when you have a changeover of the estrogen ratios and how much E2 is circulating, the body's like, wait, I need to really start storing some extra fat in case I'm getting into a starvation mode. Because the response of your endocrine system not working in your premenopausal years is a downregulation of your resting metabolic rate and a down regulation of your thyroid, an increased amount of fat that's being stored. So because you are in this fluctuation where sometimes you have estrogen and sometimes you don't, the body's kind of like, well, am I getting into a starvation mode or am I not? So this is one of the triggers for putting in that extra body fat. We also know because estrogen mediates bone turnover through insulin growth factor 1, as well as activating more of the progesterone receptor sites. Then when you start having the fluctuation of estrogen, you start decreasing your bone mineral density. So with regards to specific metabolism, I've talked about you have your decreased insulin sensitivity or increased insulin resistance. This has to do with a reduction in GLUT4 expression. And again, hold that thought on GLUT4 because I'm going to explain that in a bit. We also know that you have a decreased reliance on carbohydrate with this flatlining of your hormones. We have an increase in muscle tissue breakdown and increase in leucine oxidation because you don't have estrogen to counter progesterone, and the body is going to be in a stressed breakdown state because you have these fluctuations of these hormones. With regards to cognition and brain fog, we have a pathway within the brain. It's the tryptophan and serotonin pathway. So as I was saying earlier, when estrogen crosses the blood-brain barrier, it hypersensitizes serotonin receptors. And this is what creates a lift. But when estrogen drops, this is also what creates that depression and anxiety symptoms. And remember, when we're in perimenopause, our hormones fluctuate throughout the day. It's not a day-to-day fluctuation. It's a daily fluctuation, or actually hour to hour sometimes. So there's an incredible amount of fluctuation that's happening in perimenopause. So when we're talking about serotonin and tryptophan, when tryptophan crosses the blood-brain barrier, it also increases serotonin production. But if we increase the amount of leucine that we have from protein intake or branched chain amino acids, it goes across the blood-brain barrier on the same pathway as tryptophan. So it reduces the amount of serotonin that's produced, which is a good thing when you're experiencing hour-to-hour fluctuations that we have with perimenopause. It really helps control a lot of the neurotransmitter issues that we have that causes a lot of mood disorder, as well as that brain fog. The other aspect, we have a decrease in what we call brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So this helps with brain tissue, maintaining healthy brain tissue. Estrogen is a driver for it. So when we start having fluctuations and we have a decrease in BDNF, we have to look at ways to increase that. So we know that the other Stacy talked about gut health, and what you eat can actually improve your gut microbiome, which then translates to improved BDNF production when you have that drop off of estrogen. The other thing with the fluctuation of hormones is we have a deregulation of the mTOR complex 1. Now, the mTOR complex 1 I'm going to get to in a minute as well, but it's one of the essential steps for regulating muscle protein synthesis. So when you start having a misstep between estrogen and progesterone and the ratios, again, other cells and other systems in the body start to get a little bit confused. And one of them is the ability to stimulate anabolic or muscle building, tissue building versus this continuous stress and breakdown of tissue. So this contributes as well to that misstep in body composition that we start to see in perimenopause. So I'm hoping you're still with me. So this is what I really want to show you from a practical standpoint. The biggest body composition changes happen in the 3 to 4 years before that one point in time called menopause. So we see what happens here. We have an increase in fat mass, and then it stabilizes in your early postmenopausal years. We have a decrease in lean mass, and again, that starts to stabilize. And as we get into the late postmenopausal years, it starts to come back up, not significantly, but it does start to come up. And when we look about weight starts to gradually increase, and this is more of a driver from increased fat mass. because the drop in weight that some people experience isn't because, yay, they're losing body fat. It's because they're losing lean mass as well as bone mass. So understanding that we need to take steps before we hit that one point in time, around the 4 to 5 years before that menopause hits, where we might be in that early transition where we're starting to see a misstep in our training and we're starting to see that our training isn't working for us. That's when we really start to dig in and change what we're doing so that we don't have this creep up of fat mass and this creep down of lean mass. And we can also maintain our bone density. So on that side step, I really want to get into what is GLUT4, because I'm going to talk about it again when I talk about what kind of training we should be doing to counter some of these things that have happened when estrogen and progesterone start to flatline. So we see a lot about GLUT4 in diabetic research when insulin does not stimulate blood glucose uptake into the muscle. So diabetics are often recommended to go for a walk after eating a meal to help regulate blood glucose. So what GLUT4 is are these little gates here, and they don't require insulin to pull blood glucose in. So estrogen and insulin both can affect GLUT4 gates. So we have estrogen receptors down here, and when E2 stimulates this estrogen receptor, it also translocates our GLUT4 mechanisms to actually open up these gates within the cell wall to allow glucose just to fly in. So when we're talking about insulin resistance, it's when these little transporters here don't really respond to insulin. So we need to find a way to increase these GLUT4 gates. So we have a way to do that without having to rely on medication. So I just wanted to bring this up so as I get into training and start talking about high intensity work and plyometrics and I refer back to GLUT4, hopefully this image will be in your head to be like, oh, okay, what she means by GLUT4 are these ways of controlling blood glucose and pulling glucose into the muscle without reliance on insulin or relying on these estrogen receptors that aren't being stimulated anymore. Now, the other question I often get is, okay, and I read this all the time, especially on the Hit Play Not Pause Facebook page. I get questions all the time about my body weight changing, and I need to do calorie reduction or increase my training. So a lot of the times when we're in this mindset of how we've grown up in the 80s, 90s, seeing the supermodels, seeing Jane Fonda, having that inherent train more, eat less, train more, eat less. It's all about calories in, calories out. But I want to say definitively that that is not correct. We need to get out of the mindset of calories in, calories out. The primary reason for this and the driver for that is there is an incredible amount of research out there knowing that weight loss is very complex. But the bottom line is calorie reduction is not the answer, because when we reduce our calories, our energy compensation is more likely to kick in when you reduce rather than increase energy consumption. So what I mean by that is when you're reducing calories and you're trying to do calorie restriction for weight loss, the body looks to say, okay, well, what other processes can I downregulate that require calories because I don't have enough coming in? In premenopausal women, we see this as low energy availability, and we see this downturn of our endocrine system. We see a misstep where luteinizing hormone pulse doesn't pop up, so we start to have menstrual cycle irregularities. But when we're in perimenopause and postmenopause, we don't have that checks and balances to tell us, hey, wait, we're not eating enough. So what we do know is when you start having calorie reduction and you're not consuming enough for your training and your daily life, your body downregulates and stops looking at ways to reduce oxidative stress, to reduce inflammation, to increase recovery, to improve sleep, to change our parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system responses, because all of those take calories. And if we don't have enough coming in, then the body regulates calories that are coming in for essential mechanisms like keeping the brain going, keeping the heart going, taking care of the organs, and it ignores the other sub-factors. So when we start talking about sleep disturbance, when we start talking about inflammation issues, autoimmune diseases that come on with inflammation, we start talking about oxidative stress and poor recovery, it's a driver for understanding that you're not eating enough. It doesn't mean that calorie reduction doesn't help in a non-active, sedentary, overweight individual, but it's a slow calorie reduction that's purposefully prescribed in a different population. But for our active population, the calorie reduction is one of the worst things you could do when you're trying to lose body fat. It just doesn't work. And when we look at things like the Biggest Loser research, where you had a high amount of physical activity, and there's an incredible amount of weight loss that occurred with that high amount of physical activity and food reduction, 5 years after, when they're measuring resting metabolic rate, everything has been downturned to the point where they exist on maybe 2/3 the amount of calories that someone who is age and fitness matched, who's never gone through that high amount of weight loss, can have, because the body has reprogrammed itself to compensate for energy. So please, let's dispel that myth that calories in, calories out is the way to reduce body fat. So I want to bring up training, because the whole thing about this talk is getting you to understand these hormones have a very interconnected, tight tie with everything that we experience as women, not just reproduction. So when we're looking at these flatlining of hormones, we have to look at alternative stressors to allow our body to keep progressing, to allow us to reduce that fat gain and reduce that lean mass loss, and to maintain our bone density, to maintain our fast twitch power, explosive. So I want to get and dig into training and what we can do to kind of take the place of what these hormones used to do for us. The first and foremost thing is the traditional methods leading into perimenopause are not adequate for improving your bone, muscle, or body composition. So this is why we start seeing women who are asking, well, what's going on? My training isn't working for me like it used to work for me 5 years ago, or 2 years ago, or even 1 year ago. I don't understand. I'm putting on more body fat. I'm tired. I'm getting slower. My performance is decreasing. And the old school of thought, which none of you should have after this talk, is, oh, I'm not training hard enough and I'm eating too much. So that is a misstep. Don't go down that route. Long, slow distance is not the way to go, because when we talk about that moderate intensity zone in perimenopause to postmenopause, that is not the right kind of training to do for our bodies, because all that does is increase cortisol stress, and it keeps our body in a breakdown state. So it's not learning how to compensate for these lack of hormones. So I'm just going to refresh really fast. When we have these flatlining hormones, we have an increase in total body inflammation. We have some insulin resistance coming in. We know we have cognitive changes, mood disorders, lack of mojo, lack of motivation. We have a reduced stimulus for bone turnover because we have that flatlining of estrogen and progesterone. Now, estrogen specifically reduces, when you don't have it, you have a reduced anabolic stimulus. So the satellite cell, or the basic response for turning on muscle protein synthesis, is flatlined. The other thing I really want people to understand is the estradiol of menopausal hormone therapy or hormone replacement therapy does not improve anabolic signaling. So when you are considering should you go on MHT or not, please don't put body composition into the conversation. It can slow down the rate of lean mass loss, but it is not the right kind of estradiol to stimulate satellite cell development, because the molecular structure and the signaling that the exogenous or the pill part of, or the hormone replacement part of MHT doesn't affect the receptor sites of estradiol the same as your natural estrogen. So please, if you're considering MHT, take the body composition component out of it because it does not encourage lean mass development. This is a really interesting paper, kind of as a sidebar for people who want to read a little bit more into it. So we know that when you're looking at exogenous or external hormones to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, testosterone does in a small effect. Progesterone does in a small effect because it is changed to testosterone. So you can get a boost of satellite cell and muscle protein synthesis responses from those two exogenous hormones. But estradiol replacement does not do that. So this is a really interesting paper to do a little bit of a deep dive to understand the mechanisms. Again, if you're considering MHT and thinking about it more from a body composition standpoint, that this is a really important paper to read to get you to have some more ammunition. So when you go to your physician, you can take it away from the body composition and put it more into vasomotor, mood, and other issues that we experience as peri and postmenopausal women. So what should you do? We've all heard me talk about high intensity interval training, heavy resistance training, and plyometric or power training. And I wanted you to have that really strong background in how these hormones affect us. So as I go through these, you understand why we should be doing these things. So if we look at high intensity interval training, these are 4 really important papers to understand. That we know that when you're doing sprint interval training, so that's top end, it's not boot camp oriented, but it's a 20 to 30 seconds full gas, top end kind of sprint, that this is a stress signal that changes the way that your body stores fat. So it reduces that visceral fat gain. It reduces intramuscular fat so that we reduce our risk of sarcopenia. We reduce our risk of putting in that visceral or more dangerous abdominal fat. When we look at moderate intensity which is moderate intensity circuit training, or that high intensity interval training with separate resistance training, the HIIT with resistance training is a much better way to go to alter body composition, to improve lean mass development, and decrease visceral fat gain and intramuscular fat stores. Now, the important thing to remember also with aging, because this is an aging standpoint, even though women don't age linearly like men do, as we get older, adipose tissue turnover is not as it was when we were premenopause. So what I mean by that is there's a stimulus to store more fat and use less fat. But if we do high intensity interval training and resistance training, that changes as well, where there's an increase in the amount of fat that is used more at rest rather than during exercise. So the turnover keeps going, which again reduces the impact on putting on body fat. So the other benefits of doing high intensity interval training is we have more blood glucose control because we have greater insulin sensitivity. So the insulin receptors will be stimulated to pull glucose in. We also know that it increases GLUT4 activation. The other aspect is, although you'll have an acute inflammatory response, that acute inflammatory response triggers the body to increase anti-inflammatory cytokines. So that means you have a better recovery. Long, slow distance training has an inflammatory response, but it's not a strong enough stress to trigger the body to have this anti-inflammatory cytokine release during recovery. So we increase our total body inflammation when we have that moderate intensity, long, slow distance stuff. The other thing to remember when I talk about the BDNF, gut health is very, very important, but an acute hit of HIIT will also say to the brain, hey, wait, I need some help up here too, because I had a little bit of hypoxia. I want to increase the health of the brain tissue so I can improve my neuromuscular responses to this HIIT. So you have an increase in your BDNF release. So again, that helps with brain tissue health. And the longer term effect of this increased BDNF release is we have improved cognition and improved working memory for a longer period as we get into our later years. In some stands, it reduces the onset and risk of dementia and Alzheimer's. The other benefit is an increase in what we call VEGF. So VEGF is very important for your blood vessel function. So when we're talking about vasomotor symptoms, and we have this misstep between dilation and constriction, when you have more VEGF, then you have a faster response. So you reduce your vasomotor symptoms because your body can really change on a dime with blood flow. And that's something that starts to slow down when we lose estrogen. We also have a greater growth hormone response, which means that we have more available GH for increasing the anabolic stimulus to build lean mass, to repair damaged tissue, to improve our immune system. It increases free testosterone, which is again beneficial for lean mass development. It's also beneficial for increasing our immune system. And we hear all these things about how peri and postmenopausal women shouldn't do high intensity because we have an increase in cortisol. But with the increase of free testosterone and growth hormone that's released, it counters cortisol. Baseline cortisols drop over a chronic adaptation response to high intensity training. Whereas if you're doing that long, slow, moderate intensity work, you don't have this growth hormone response. You don't have an increase in free testosterone, but you do have an increase in cortisol, which becomes an issue, especially when we're in this changing hormone balance, which causes a lot of stress anyway. So we want to look at how we can counter cortisol at every step of the way. And the other thing, it's a really strong stimulus to decrease visceral and intramuscular fat gain, which translates into better body composition. And of course, I'm not going to ignore lifting heavy stuff or heavy resistance training. I love this t-shirt. Thanks, Feisty. So when we're talking about lifting heavy shit, what I mean by that is you want to do it carefully. So you have really good form, function, and remembering that lifting heavy is very relative. If you've never done anything under the bar, then you're starting with body weight. If you're hesitant to lift weights in the gym, then you find someone that can help you. You can use the EC Fit programs to learn form and function, hiring a PT. You can go for some of the newer technology like the tonal systems that are at home with feedback cues. But really super important to put that resistance training in. The other super, super important thing about resistance training is you need protein post-exercise. And the reason we lift heavy is to increase muscle protein synthesis, but also that neuromuscular connection to maintain explosive power and to maintain speed, which we need not only in performance for sport, but also in daily life for our reflexes. So I want to go through a little bit of why I'd say protein is really important to back it up. Now, this is a very complex scientific slide, and I'm not going to go through it step by step, but I want to show you what the muscle protein synthesis pathway is so that we get a better understanding of what's going on when we're exercising. So we know that when we are taking in amino acids or protein and we are doing some kind of exercise stress, we have a stimulus of the Reb. So Reb is a feed forward. In order to stimulate this mTOR complex, which is really super important for getting muscle protein synthesis, the Reb has to be stimulated. The way this is stimulated is through amino acids. There's also estrogen receptor sites that stimulate the Reb as well as the mTOR. And we know that mechanical work, physical activity also stimulates it. So we have three areas where we can get muscle protein synthesis going. When we lose estrogen, we have to rely on the other two. So when I go through it a little bit closer, I've circled these. We have physical activity stress that directly stimulates the mTOR. We also have amino acids that directly stimulate the mTOR. We need mTOR to be stimulated in order to get muscle protein synthesis going. When we lose estrogen, we lose the insulin and IGF-1 stimulus. We also lose the upstream of the Reb stimulus. So when I talk about lifting heavy and doing high intensity work and following it up with protein, it's all about maximizing these other two pathways that don't rely on estrogen or insulin to stimulate mTOR. So it's important to understand why I talk about that when we start to lose our hormones, because we want to find a way to get the same responses that we'd had when we were premenopausal as when we get into peri and postmenopause. And you can complement that response by backing up heavy physical activity stress work with appropriate amino acids, again, to get that 1-2 punch of mTOR, because we don't have estrogen that works for us anymore. This is what happens if we don't have enough amino acids coming in. Then we get an inactivity of mTOR. You have enough amino acids coming in, but bam, we have all of the stuff that's going on with mTOR to create new cells, to instigate the muscle protein synthesis, to create an anabolic response, which also shuts down that breakdown or that catabolic response that we have. If we don't eat enough, we don't follow our exercise up with protein and maybe a little bit of carbohydrate. I'm sure Dina's talked about that. But super, super important as aging women who are trying to perform and maintain good body composition and feel good about our performance, whatever that might mean, that we're backing our exercise up with protein to get this mTOR complex going, again, to decrease catabolism and increase our ability to build lean mass. So the other thing is power training. So we have high intensity interval training, we have lifting heavy, and we have plyometrics. Now, plyometrics is all about increasing explosive power and speed. So this can be counter jumps or counter movement jumps. It can be box jumps. It could be touchdown taps. So you have one foot on a box and you're lowering slowly down, hitting the heel and exploding back up. So it's any kind of explosive movement. If you have contraindications of osteoarthritis, ACL issues, then no, you might not be able to instigate and implement plyometric work into your training. If you've never done plyometric work, you want to start off slow. It can just be skips down the road, anything that is explosive. And the plyometrics is that bounding. The reason why it's so important when we lose the estrogen and the progesterone ability to stimulate that fast, explosive power, again, we have to find other means of getting our body to improve power and speed, but also increase GLUT4 proteins. So with that explosive power and explosive movement, it improves our mitochondrial function, so it improves our aerobic capacity. It also improves our antioxidant responses, our anti-inflammatory responses, because if we have improved mitochondrial function, then downstream it helps with the oxidation and inflammation. We have improved muscle integrity because of the neuromuscular component of explosive power and speed. So again, we're going to improve the way that we are running so we don't get into an Ironman shuffle. We can lift our knees. We can have some spring in our step. We can do box jumps. We can do circuit work. So it's all in the eye of how am I improving what I'm doing, not only from muscle integrity, but also down the line for improving recovery. The big thing, again, is it increases that GLUT4 protein response, because when we're doing plyometric power training, it's very high energetic work. So the body's like, wait a second, I need to have an ability to pull carbohydrate or glucose in quickly. So it activates more of the GLUT4 protein responses. So then you end up with less insulin resistant effects because your body can handle your blood glucose and maintain a glucose homeostasis. So to review, high intensity interval training, because that helps with body composition. It also helps with cognition and brain health. It also helps with blood sugar control. We want to do heavy resistance training for neuromuscular stimulus. as well as stimulating lean mass development when we follow it up with protein. And we want to include plyometrics power training to increase explosive power and speed, which then downstream improves our muscle power composition, our mitochondrial function, so our antioxidant effects, our anti-inflammatory effects, and it improves the amount of GLUT4 proteins that are available to pull glucose into the cells that needs it. So our training modifications to consider. Now, when I talked about calorie restriction, I know that women are very much still in the idea of, I still need to lose body weight. If it is hard for you to understand that calorie restriction is not the way to go, the very first thing you need to do is fuel for what you are doing. Please don't do any kind of fasted training. Fasted training drives up cortisol. It drives up that catabolic response. And those are the two factors that will contribute to increased visceral fat gain, lean mass loss, bone density loss. Fuel for what you're doing before and after. It can be your breakfast, but definitely post-exercise, you need to get that protein in. So important for the mechanics of building lean mass, mechanics of bone tissue development, all of those things that estrogen, progesterone used to help. Again, these training modifications and following up with good protein hits is the way to counter what those hormones aren't doing for us anymore. So we also need the exercise stress. So remembering high intensity work, heavy resistance training, plyometric work, not that moderate intensity stuff, but you need a high exercise stress and protein intake post to instigate that muscle protein synthesis, as well as to reduce the total body catabolism or breakdown effect that's so endemic in peri and postmenopause. We also know that there are sex differences in day-to-day intensity recovery, and that's premenopause all the way through postmenopause. So we need a little bit more recovery, and as our hormones start to shift, and as we get into postmenopause, we need more recovery. The other thing to remember is that when you are switching over to doing more high-intensity work, heavy resistance training, less volume. We need less volume, less volume, less volume, to hit those intensities. It's very polarized. If you wake up and you're too tired to hit that high intensity, then you don't do that, because then you end up in that moderate intensity zone where you don't want to be. So the idea of more recovery is so that you can hit the stressors that you want to hit for training adaptations. And it's also looking at changing over a periodization model to, instead of having 3 weeks undulation or a 3-week block of training, you're having a 2-week block of training and then a 1 week of deloading or recovery. And that 2-week block of training, this is where you're really looking at day-to-day recovery, because when you go to do your training, you want to be refreshed enough to be able to hit that super high intensity and know what it means to go hard, or to be able to progress in your heavy lifts. Recovery is super essential. And the other reason for all these training modifications is to maintain neuromuscular stimulation and muscle integrity, not only for performance, but when you're 100 years old and you want to carry your own groceries. So you have really strong postural muscles, really strong joint responses, tendon responses. And it's just for a better quality of life as we age. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about a little bit of nutrition guidelines, but I'm not going to dig into all the details here because I know Dina's done a fantastic job on this, as well as some of the other speakers. But I do want to point out that when we talk about calorie reduction, it's not about calorie reduction, because we know that doesn't work. But what we can do is we can modulate what we're eating and how much we're eating on a day-to-day basis, depending on what kind of training we're doing, because we don't want to get into an energy compensation. So a best example is if you're going for a long or hard ride on a Saturday, you don't feel very hungry. Sunday, not that hungry. Monday, you're super hungry. So you're eating. That's how your body's compensating for energy lost. And we don't necessarily want to get into that, because this is, again, how we can have a little bit of misstep. So we know that recovery days, we eat a little bit less. Moderate intensity, we eat a little bit more. improving our carbohydrate intake to fuel for that high intensity work, heavy training. If you're doing 2 sessions a day, if you're doing competition work, you're increasing carbohydrate, but across the board, that protein intake is high. That protein intake is moderated in and around training as well as your meals. Fat intake, these are just guidelines, but fat intake is not something that you should shy away from. We actually do need a significant amount of good fats in our diet to support nervous function as well as immune cells. So this is just an example because so many people tend to undereat. So if we're talking about a 45 to 50-year-old female athlete who weighs 59 kilos and is 21% body fat. So we know that we need to have a minimum sitting on the couch watching Netflix calorie intake of around 1,500 calories. I have some women who talk to me and say, I eat 1,500 calories on a big day of training because I'm trying to lose weight. Significantly under eating. You have to eat more to see gains in your body composition in a positive way, and to eat more to see gains in your training. The top end intake for a very low recovery type activity day is 2,000 calories. As soon as you get up off that couch and start moving, you're adding calories to what you need to take. And we hear so much stuff about postmenopausal women's body or calorie needs going down. It's because we've lost that lean mass. So maintaining that lean mass also means increasing our calorie intake in and around training, because the other thing is we can't build lean mass if we don't have abundance of nutrients to allow our body to build it. So this is just kind of an example. Don't be afraid of eating grains. Like complex carbohydrates, really good. Also really good for reducing insulin resistance and moderating blood glucose control. We want to make sure that you eat a wide variety of really good protein foods, but make the bulk of your diet leafy greens, carbohydrate coming from fruit and veg. This helps with gut health. It helps with inflammation, oxidation, and helps with so many other smaller functions in the body that estrogen, progesterone used to help with. And then when we, again, talk about carbohydrates and insulin sensitivity, because estrogen and progesterone are flatlined and we have a changeover in our cellular responses to insulin because of the GLUT4 as well as a reduction in IGF-1, which can act as an insulin. We know that estrogen dominance contributes to that elevated blood glucose. So you really want to focus on the types of carbohydrates that you are eating. So you want to look for fruits, veg, some complex grains, making a good colorful plate to feed your gut microbiome. All of these things come into play to improve our day-to-day life, our immune system, as well as our body composition, and help moderate some of those neuromuscular changes that are occurring with serotonin and dopamine. So I'm going to bring us back up. Satellite cell signaling for lean mass development depends on exercise stress. So we know if you reflect back to that diagram that I showed you, where we want to maximize the 2 pathways to mTOR because we don't have 4 pathways anymore. The 2 pathways are amino acids and exercise stress. So you want to do your exercise stress and follow it up with protein. Now we know that in our postmenopausal, and we can even go early, or I should say late perimenopause into menopause to postmenopause, we're looking at a dose of 40 grams of whey protein isolate equivalent or 6 grams of leucine-enriched essential amino acids. So this study here, Wilkinson and Bukhari from the Clinical Nutrition, goes into depth about comparing 3 grams of leucine, 40 grams of whey protein isolate, or 3.5 grams of leucine with essential amino acids to complement it to get a total of 6 grams. And the outcome is 40 grams of whey protein isolate or those 6 grams of leucine. Extend that anabolic window, reduce your breakdown effect, and just help stimulate lean mass development. So super important to get that dosing right after exercise. The circulating amino acid pool that comes with eating protein is more than just leucine. We have arginine that helps with endothelial function. So this again helps with blood pressure control. We know that a lot of women start to experience high blood pressure responses when estrogen starts to flatline. Arginine is really helpful in going back to endothelial or the cells that line the blood vessels and help them respond to nitric oxide to improve that vasodilation, vasoconstriction response. It also helps with vasomotor symptoms. When we're looking at how are our body responding to quick shifts in temperature and blood flow, we need to have really good endothelial function. So estrogen used to be a driver for that. So if we start increasing our amino acid pool, having a great amount of arginine, then we get that same response. It's amazing what happens when people increase their total protein intake across the board. So lysine, it blocks arginine from being absorbed into the cell, which keeps it in the plasma, which then again helps with endothelial function. And of course, I've talked about leucine for muscle protein synthesis, but again, it's also important for mitigating that serotonin overproduction and then dump, because leucine uses the same pathway to get into the brain as tryptophan. And if you have a reduction in tryptophan, you have a reduction in serotonin production. These are all good things, all good things. So the last thing I want to talk about when I said no calorie restriction is it's important to understand the timing and fueling for what you're doing. So if we go into what is nutrient timing, and I'm sure Dina's talked about this in depth as well, so I'm just going to give you a brief overview. The idea of nutrient timing, it means that you are eating for what you are doing. So you are eating protein and carbohydrate in and around a session. Why do we do that? We do that because when we are exercising, we are creating a stress. We are creating a catabolic state. Your body is understanding the stress. If we're not fueling and giving the body the nutrients it needs during that stress, then it doesn't learn. It doesn't increase adaptations. It doesn't facilitate repair of damaged tissue. And it's more like you're going out and doing a hard session for naught. You're not going to garner the adaptation responses you want if you're not fueling appropriately. So this is why it's really, really important not to do fasted training and to really look at what you're eating before and after each session. Again, we're talking about the pathways for improving insulin control, blood glucose control, lean mass development, brain health. It has to do with that nutrient timing to be able to help our body where those hormones used to help us. So nutrient timing, super important, especially as we get into the peri and postmenopausal years. So you are manipulating your nutrient intake before, during, and after training. And it dramatically influences how you recover from that session. So as I talk about doing high intensity work, heavy resistance training, recovery is paramount so that you can go back and hit it hard again and stay out of that moderate intensity zone. It also affects how you adapt to training, because if you have the fuel for that stress, then your body's like, great, I can overcome the stress and get stronger. And that's what training is about. We are trying to teach our body how to become stronger from the stresses we put it under. So our outcomes for our nutrient timing, again, it decreases that catabolic state. If you're eating post-exercise, your body gets out of that breakdown state, starts to get into that reparation state, lean mass development, decreases the signaling for visceral fat gain, improves your blood glucose control. It reduces your low energy availability risk factors, which are really hard to pin down when your hormones are all over the show. But when we know that if you are in a low energy availability state or with calorie reduction and you're not eating post-exercise and stay in this catabolic state, then your body is going to divert calories away from trying to fix inflammation, oxidation, torn tissue, immune function. So super important to eat in and around training. And of course, for gut microbiome support. Definitely need to look at how we improve our gut microbiome without estrogen and progesterone to affect so many factors within the brain. So when you get back to protein, timing, dose, and distribution, we know that specific to leucine, that 6 grams of leucine with an essential amino acid to hit that leucine threshold is super important. You want to think about what kinds of proteins that you're using. There are a lot of women who are becoming vegan, which is fantastic, doing plant-based, but you know that the composition of one scoop of plant-based protein doesn't have the same amount of leucine as one scoop of whey protein. For example, it takes 50 grams of soy to get the same leucine as 25 grams of whey. The one plant-based source that is almost the same as whey protein is pea protein isolate. But if you're mixing pea protein isolate with hemp or mixing it with brown rice, then you're boosting it to match that of whey. And we also know that you can't make up protein intake. You can't be like, oh, okay, I'm going to eat a whole bunch and then I'm not going to eat any. Or I'm going to eat a little bit, a little bit, and a little bit, and a little bit, and a little bit, because continuous feeding doesn't help, because the cells will stop muscle protein synthesis to conserve energy. And if you do one big, huge bolus, then it can only uptake as much as it can in that point in time. So the best thing to do is to distribute protein intake throughout the meals in a regular dose, and really hone in on that post-exercise protein intake of all the macronutrients, timing and distribution across the board, across the day. Protein is really important for that timing and distribution, rather than just thinking about total macros in a day. So I'll take a breather, and all I want to say is I want you to own this period in your life. It's not something to be ashamed of. It's not something to suffer from. I'm really excited that the Hit Play Not Pause podcast and feed has come through. The Feisty Menopause Summit is here, because the more we talk about it and the more we own this and the more we understand it, the more power we have for ourselves and future generations of women who are going to experience this. So I want to say thanks to LiveFeisty and Celine Yeager. I should have put a picture of our new book coming up, but I wasn't sure if we were supposed to or not. So Roar has a little bit on peri and postmenopause, but our new book is fully diving into all of this. And if you have questions, join me in the booth after this. That would be fantastic.